Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Does Israel have an endgame for the war in Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. Israel has been pounding Gaza for more than a month, ever since the Hamas surprise attack of October 7th, resulting in more than 1,400 Israelis killed and another 200 taken hostage. At this point, more than 10,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces, about half of them children. Today, the narrow strip has been split in two, and most of its 2.3 million civilians have been displaced by the nonstop Israeli shelling. The humanitarian situation on the ground has become dire. Food, water, medicine, and fuel shortages are reaching catastrophic levels. And the United Nations said more of its aid workers have been killed in Gaza than in any period in the history of the United Nations. All of which brings to mind the famous quote of General David Petraeus from 20 years ago when U.S. forces were invading Iraq. He said, "Tell me how this ends. The death and destruction continue, but what's the end game for Israel?" Today, we're talking to Congressman Seth Moulton, a Democrat representing Massachusetts and a veteran of the Marine Corps who served in the Iraq War. Congressman Moulton, thank you so much for joining us. Look, you served 4 terms in Iraq. You know what war feels like and sees. You saw your friends die, you saw civilians die, and you saw enemy combatants die. I'm just interested, given your experience of that, what frame should we be considering as we look today at the crisis between Israel and Hamas in Gaza?
Well, first of all, let's just acknowledge war is absolutely horrific. War should be avoided at all costs. And the worst part of war is when innocent people die. And innocent people always die in war. And we saw innocent civilians in Israel massacred barbarically by Hamas. And now we're seeing innocent civilians in Gaza killed every day in Israeli airstrikes. This is a horrible tragedy. I think the important context to look at this war, though, is that this is not a force-on-force war like Russia versus Ukraine or the United States versus Germany in World War II. This is a real counterinsurgency where the fight is not just to defeat Hamas for Israel. The fight is also to win over the population so that Hamas...
To win their hearts and minds.
You do have to win their hearts and minds.
How is that going from your early watch of a month into this war?
I don't think it's going very well, to be candid. And look, I look at this from the perspective of I want Israel to defeat Hamas. I want Israel and Palestinians to live. I want Israel and Palestine to have peace. I want Israeli citizens, Palestinian citizens to not have to worry that they're going to get killed in their sleep. But to get there, I do think you have to defeat terrorists. But you can't recruit more terrorists in the process. And the number one way to recruit terrorists to the cause is to kill innocent civilians.
Well, you wrote a very powerful and interesting piece of the likes that I haven't read out there about war and conflict relevant to the Israeli-Gaza crisis in CNN.com. I highly recommend that people take a look at that article. But in it, you talk about McChrystal's math. Tell us about that.
So General Stanley McChrystal, famous counterinsurgent American general in Afghanistan, he talked about how there's this, what he calls insurgent math. And he estimates the equation to be for every one civilian that you kill, you recruit about 10 terrorists. So in other words, if Israel...
Every one civilian, let's focus on that, one innocent person of whom thousands have now been killed, we know, because over half of the 10,000 are children. So innocent right there. But tell us how many insurgents are created
so this is a problem.
In his estimate.
So Israel has a math problem, and it's measured in human lives. That if they go in and they say, we're going to take out this one Hamas terrorist, but in the process they kill just one civilian, well, by General McChrystal's math, you've just recruited 10 new Hamas terrorists to the cause. That means you recruited 10, you killed one, you're +9. That's not moving in the right direction if you want to actually take out this terrorist organization.
As you kind of look at your experience there, and it's something that I think you acknowledge is very, very different, that the density of buildings, of people, wildly different than a place that's like stacked up with people like London today. It's like going through and trying to find, the bad folks amongst a lot of good folks. How do you process that? And I want to acknowledge, I was very taken with your comment that you called in a bombing raid on a school. You flattened a school.
So it was a difficult decision to make, but here's the context that was so different than Gaza. We knew that there were no civilians in that neighborhood. To the best of our knowledge, all the civilians had evacuated. That's because we, in many ways, conditioned the battlefield. We made sure that civilians had a way to get out. We went into this building where Americans had already taken several casualties, and then my Marines, my platoon, took casualties as well. And I was faced with this decision. Do I continue fighting up the stairs where they're rolling grenades down at us, or do I pull the Marines out and drop a bomb on the building to take care of the threat, the insurgents, but also wreck a school that we would have to rebuild if we wanted to win back popular support? And I made the decision. I said, this is not worth more Marine lives, so I dropped a bomb. But then the tough work started, because after we finished the fighting in Najaf in 2004, we spent months and months rebuilding the city so that we could rebuild trust with the Iraqi people, who, by the way, much like the Palestinians, they didn't want to be living under terrorists, but they weren't sure they could trust Americans. We had to earn that trust.
You also cite General Mattis and something he said, which I found really interesting. He said, I want the military to be looked at as the enemy's worst enemy, but as the people's, as there would be no better friend.
That's right.
And I found it very interesting to hear those, because we're not talking in those terms. Right now we're caught in rage, we're caught in emotion, but even President Biden acknowledged that rage, the blindness of rage, can be a bad place to start. So I'm just interested in how you see through that, and how do you orient a military to be no worse enemy and no better friend?
Well, this was our 1st Marine Division motto. But it wasn't our motto when we went into Iraq. When we went into Iraq, we didn't understand the consequences of killing civilians. We tried to avoid it because it's the right thing to do. But we were just trying to defeat the Iraqi army. It took us years to appreciate, to realize that we were in a counterinsurgency campaign where it was just as important to win over the civilian population as it was to defeat the enemy. So General Mattis introduced that motto to tell every single Marine that you had to prove every single day that your enemies would find no greater foe. But at the same time, if you put your trust in us, if you put your trust in the United States Marine Corps, you won't find a better friend. That was really important to this whole concept of winning over the civilian population. And what struck me is that we would spend often much more time focused on the no better friend part than on the no worse enemy. I mean, we might spend days rebuilding infrastructure, working with Iraqi politicians, and then we might spend a couple hours at night going on a raid to take out a few terrorists. When I later worked for General Petraeus, it was the same thing. He would agonize over restoring power to parts of Baghdad. In fact, he sent my small team of Marines once on a mission into enemy-held territory, a place where Americans didn't want to go, for the sole purpose, not of taking out terrorists, but of fixing a power line, because he knew it was so important to win over the support of the civilian population by showing you could deliver services.
You know, I just went back and I sort of did a search of news headlines of military during the Iraq War, during Afghanistan, and I found one with this as someone you probably know, who is the former head of U.S. Central Command, Frank McKenzie, who said a Kabul drone strike that killed 10 civilians, which they thought was part of terrorist infrastructure, was a tragic mistake. Killed and were killed. And came out on television, admitted the mistake publicly. I have the article for that. It may be too early in this war to see that, but how much does confession, apology, recognition of those mistakes publicly fit into the hearts and minds strategy?
It's a good question, Steve. I think it matters a lot. And again, I'm not saying that we always got it right. The message I'm trying to send to the Israelis, who have every right to defend their country, every right to defend their civilian population, every right to take out terrorists just as we did after 9/11. The message I'm trying to send is learn from our mistakes. Because in the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan, you would never hear the U.S. apologize for civilian casualties. But as we came to appreciate how important it was to show the civilian population that you can trust us, you can work with us, we're a better alternative to the terrorists. As we came to appreciate that, we were much more candid and open and honest and transparent, and part of that is being willing to admit mistakes.
Now, Seth, publicly you're out there on this, but you said in this time of conflict, we need to begin thinking about end games. You need to envision other things. You need to think about hearts and minds. I'm just interested in how this is playing with your constituents and also this town. You know, how are you getting criticized for this, or are you being applauded for your?
Well, I mean, first of all, I always get criticized. Pretty much no matter what you say, you're going to get criticized. But no, I think in many ways people realize that that what I'm trying to do here is not just sort of find a middle ground, but really stand on moral principle. Because there are strong moral reasons why we don't need to see innocent lives upended or ended in this conflict. But there are real military reasons as well. So you can be the staunchest supporter of Israel, and I am a staunch supporter of Israel, of the Israeli state, of Israel's fundamental right, even responsibility to defend its citizens, while also saying, if I want Israel to win this war, they've got to be more careful. They've got to minimize civilian casualties, because that's what we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Now, the president and his team, President Biden, has called for a pause, a ceasefire. You've called for humanitarian corridors. You've called for various dimensions to try to give, you know, people who are innocent an opportunity to escape this hell that they're in right now. How do you think that's going?
Well, look, there's a little bit of a battle over words here. A lot of people, I get a lot of calls in the office saying, why won't you support a ceasefire? I mean, first of all, Israel's not going to agree to a ceasefire. And if you
They
just
made that very clear.
They made that very clear.
But, you know, the Secretary General of the UN has called for a ceasefire. Lots of others have called for a ceasefire. The Arab world that was normalizing in large part with Israel through the Abraham Accords has also called for a ceasefire. We have said we understand Israel's not going to call for a ceasefire.
Look, also, a lot of Arab leaders really want Hamas taken out. And that's something that may not resonate with the Arab street, but is a reality in this complicated part of the world, the Middle East. But here's the reality. Israel's not going to agree to a ceasefire. And on top of that, a ceasefire really would empower Hamas, allow them time to reconstitute. So what we need fundamentally is not a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause, both terms that suggest we're going to take a break from the fighting, but then we're going to go right back at it the way we've been doing it. No, what we need is a civilian evacuation. That's fundamentally what we need. And that's another lesson that we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan.
But the lesson the civilians in Palestine have learned is once they evacuate, they don't get back in. So that's one of the big concerns. If you talk to Palestinians on the other side of the equation, those that have gone into Jordan, others in times of crisis, they can't get back into lands they once had. So what do we do with that fear? And is there some negotiation, some deal that gets civilian evacuation but doesn't result in them not being able to get back into Gaza, into their homes?
No, it's a great question. And what we did in Fallujah, for example, the second time Marines went into Fallujah, they had evacuated about 90% of the civilians. So only 10% of the civilians in that entire city were left when the Marines went in.
So when Fallujah went in, almost everybody there was tied into the
That's right.
group,
They made the decision to stay and fight, and so the Marines took them out. Part of the way we were able to facilitate that civilian evacuation is by promising the civilians, the residents, that they could go back, that they would be able to return. So you have to have this plan. You have to be able to lay out your end game.
So have you talked to your Israeli friends and folks that you've talked to in the U.S. government said that's a very key part? Because right now what's happening is the IDF and other folks just say, hey, move south, move down. And yet, as people have moved south, particularly to refugee camps, they've continued to get bombed in places where they were told to go because of a commander being somewhere, allegedly, or others. And so the broadside is, how do you get some element of trust that where they're being sent to go is something that's not going to end up getting them killed?
So I've called for not a ceasefire, but a civilian evacuation. I've also called for not a humanitarian pause, just a temporary cessation, but a humanitarian surge, where you don't just bring in the minimum amount of aid to southern Gaza, you bring in the maximum amount to show the people that if you evacuate, if you move out of the north into the south, you'll not just get a small bit of aid, you'll get a lot. In other words, it's really worth it for you to make this journey to leave Hamas behind.
Certain senators, like Senator Chris Murphy, Senator Chris Van Hollen, have begun to move and said, we need to have some oversight of how the weapons that the United States has now provided to Israel are being used. The White House has rejected that thus far and said we don't want to impose any limits on those. Do you think there should be some limit? I think the world looks at the United States as a defender of Israeli security and security needs, but should there be constraints on what Israel can do with our partnership?
Steve, everything I've been calling for in this debate and in our conversation today preserves innocent life. It fundamentally helps innocent Palestinians. It also helps Israel win. It helps Israel defeat Hamas. And I think that what the president has been trying to do here is stand staunchly by our ally, our most important ally in the Middle East. That's Israel. Allow them to defend their territory, but help them do so in a way that is not only morally successful, but militarily successful as well. And I do think that the president is looking for ways to exert more influence over the Israelis to learn those lessons, the same lessons that I'm describing that we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. One of those, probably the most paramount, being you have to explain the end game. You have to have a political solution to something that is fundamentally a political problem. You're not just going to solve this by military means. That means being able to explain to the Palestinians what their future is. It also means, by the way, Netanyahu's got to be able to explain to his troops what they're fighting for. Right. Because I think his soldiers know that if they just go into Gaza and leave it a smoldering mess, at the end of the day, they're going to be right back where they started.
Well, that's a forever war. So are we looking at the ingredients today of a forever war?
Right now on the ground, we have the ingredients of a forever war. And that's not a recipe that any of us want. So I think that for Israel's success...
Well, that's also the recipe where a dad, a mother cannot go out and justify and think about why their child was killed battling in that if you have a forever war without end.
We don't want any innocent 5-year-old Palestinian kids dying in this conflict. We also don't want innocent 5-year-old Israelis dying in this same conflict 20 years from now when they're still fighting it.
I'm just interested with you have such insight. What does this do in terms of trauma for the Israeli nation, but also for Gazans and Palestinians who have for decades been locked in a vice?
I mean, Steve, I know so many amazing Americans, some of the greatest Americans I've ever met in my life, who fought heroically in Iraq and Afghanistan and are still haunted by it. They made it home, but they're tremendously hobbled by post-traumatic stress. And that's going to be a reality for Jewish citizens of Israel. It's going to be a reality for Muslim citizens of Palestine. It is going to be a horrific reality for everyone who's caught up in this conflict. And it's one of the reasons why, at the end of the day, we all have to be aligned for peace.
I had a guy on the show recently who said, hey, President Biden got 20 trucks of humanitarian relief in at the beginning of this. He says a low-level State Department staffer can be counted on to get 20 trucks. This is the President of the United States who got 20 trucks of relief, which is pathetic. I mean, part of the question is Joe Biden being made to look pathetically weak when it comes to interactions with Israel over this?
No, I don't think so. Israel has gone through the greatest national tragedy in its history, and President Biden made them significantly delay their ground assault to try to influence them on how they carry it out. I think this could be a lot worse if not for President Biden's involvement to date.
What do you think the geopolitical dimensions of this are, Seth? When we talked last, we talked about the Ukraine war in Russia and the failure of deterrence. You worry about Asia, the signals that some of these send around the world, and there are concerns now that China is testing the dashboard of America's attention span across things. Is the world sensing America is distracted, sort of off its game, that it can't handle this many of hot conflicts around the world?
I think we're showing the world right now that we can handle this number of conflicts, but there are real risks. There are real risks. There are real risks that the conflict in Gaza expands dramatically into a regional war in the Middle East. There are real risks that the message that Xi Jinping takes from looking at Ukraine is the Americans aren't going to stick with their democratic allies. Putin might eventually win this war, and that means I can get away with starting a war in the Pacific over Taiwan. So there are real risks. And for everyone who's quick to criticize the United States and different things that we do in different parts of the world, it's also important to understand that the United States is pretty much holding this all together. We're preventing a regional war in the Middle East with our presence. We're preventing Vladimir Putin from rolling over Ukraine and rolling right into a European war with NATO. And every single day we're sending a message to Xi Jinping in China: do not invade democratic Taiwan. Don't start World War III in the Pacific.
Let me ask you about Prime Minister Netanyahu. If you were to have a conversation with him about what an end game would look like, and he's come out and said that every aspect of Gazan security is now going to be in Israel's hands. I don't want to just critique Prime Minister Netanyahu. I want to understand what's the pathway to getting to something where both sides can see hope during a time of rage, really, on both sides, can begin looking at something that looks like a sensible endgame, because somebody's got to begin doing that. What would you counsel him to do in this moment?
I would say, Mr. Prime Minister, I understand how furious you are. I understand how angry your people are. But the right thing to do for every Israeli kid, the right thing to do for every Palestinian kid, is to find a new solution, a political endgame that both sides can believe in, where both sides can find peace. And that means you've got to convince Palestinian innocent civilians and Israelis as well that there's a better way. I think that's a two-state solution, but it's a reinvigorated two-state solution. It's a new commitment from a prime minister who's been fundamentally opposed to a two-state solution for a long time to actually make it happen.
The United States is no longer looked at by many Palestinians and also Arabs as a fair broker in that. I've been watching Turkey and President Erdogan and his strong support both of Hamas but of the Palestinian side of the equation. Turkey's a NATO ally of the United States. Is there an opportunity there you could actually reshuffle the traditional players that have been trying to negotiate a deal and try and look at Turkey's better impulses as a defender of interests on the Palestinian side and the United States on the Israeli side? Or do we still need to maintain what I would call a fiction that we can be fair to both sides?
Well, look, I think a lot of people rightly ask, Seth, I mean, how can you just advocate for a two-state solution when this hasn't worked for decades? I think one of the things that's changed in the Middle East is you now have Arab states, places like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, that actually want to have dialogue with Israel. I mean, Israel has been pursuing peace with its Arab neighbors. Let's turn that into action. Let's turn these agreements into real differences on the ground. I think that if Israel finds a way, with our help, to get Arab states involved in a two-state solution, ultimately ensuring its success, that's more believable for everybody.